Welcome back to Librarian Oasis. I'm Joshua.
And I'm Eleanor.
We've got a really fascinating book to dive into today.
It is fascinating.
How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them by Barbara F. Walter.
Definitely a good one.
If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend checking it out.
Absolutely.
It's
eye-opening.
yeah, it's a bit unsettling in parts, but
It is.
I think it's really important to understand these things.
I agree.
So to kind of get started,
Yeah.
Walter kind of starts the book by challenging this idea
Right.
that civil wars are just something that happens like in far-off countries.
Yeah, over there somewhere.
Right, exactly, in underdeveloped nations. And she actually uses the example of the attempted kidnapping of Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer
Oh, wow.
in 2020 to illustrate how the seeds of these types of conflicts can even pop up in stable democracies like the U.S.
Yeah. I remember when that happened, I was pretty shocked that something like that could happen here.
Well, it's like, what does that even look like here? Think of like, war-torn countries or whatever, but
Exactly.
like, what does that look like here? So anyway,
Yeah.
so that's kind of how she starts out.
Yeah. And she talks about anocracy
Yeah.
as one of the contributing factors.
Anocracy.
Yeah.
It's
a tough word.
It's a tough word, and a lot of people aren't really familiar with it,
Yeah.
but it's important to understand it.
Yeah. So can you break down anocracy for us?
Sure. So basically, anocracy describes a country that's kind of stuck in between a democracy and an autocracy.
Right.
So it's not fully democratic, but it's
Yeah.
also not a dictatorship.
Right.
And so it's basically a country in transition
Okay.
where the rules of the game are kind of unclear
Gotcha.
and power dynamics are constantly shifting.
So a political limbo?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
So you can see how that would...
Be a breeding ground for instability
Right.
and violence.
Yeah. So she talks about how these transitioning states are particularly vulnerable.
Especially those leaning more towards democracy.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because you have rapid shifts in power dynamics.
Right.
And that can lead to a lot of uncertainty and fear.
Right, because the people who are in power
Exactly.
are losing power.
They're seeing their power slip away.
Right.
And they don't like that. And so they're more likely to resort to violence.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So she uses Ethiopia's Tigray region as an example of this.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is a really stark example of how quickly things can unravel.
Yeah.
So Ethiopia had been going through all these rapid democratic reforms,
Okay.
and that actually created an opening for conflict.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, former government officials
Right.
felt like their power was slipping away,
Right.
and they launched this rebellion
Oh, wow.
that plunged the region into a really devastating civil war. So it's kind of a tragic illustration of how even well-intentioned reforms can really backfire if they're not carefully managed.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Is there an example of one that happened more smoothly?
Yeah, she contrasts Ethiopia with Mexico.
Okay.
Where the transition to democracy was much more gradual.
Okay.
It actually spanned almost 2 decades.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was a very slow and steady approach.
Okay.
And that gave institutions time to mature.
Right.
It lessened uncertainty.
Right.
And it allowed the elites to relinquish power without feeling too threatened.
Right.
So Mexico's democratization was far less violent
Right.
than what we saw in Ethiopia.
That's interesting.
Yeah. It's a good example of how pacing and managing expectations are really important during these transitions.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've talked about anocracy,
Right.
but like, how does a stable democracy even backslide into that zone?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Like, how do you even get there
Right.
from a stable democracy?
Walter finds this trend particularly alarming.
Yeah.
Because for decades, we saw a global wave of democratization.
Right.
But now that tide seems to be turning.
Yeah.
Even in countries that were once considered like models of democratic stability.
And she uses Hungary as an example.
Exactly. Yeah, Hungary under Prime Minister Viktor Orban has seen a really steady erosion of democratic norms and institutions.
Yeah. How so?
Well, Orban has consolidated his power.
Okay.
He's undermined the independence of the judiciary.
Wow.
And he's restricted freedom of the press.
Wow. So it's like...
And he's done all of this while maintaining this kind of veneer of democratic legitimacy.
So it's like a slow creep.
Right. It's not always a dramatic overthrow.
Right.
It can be this much more subtle process.
Oh, that's scary.
Yeah, it is.
So what are some of the things that contribute to that?
Well, Walter argues that this backsliding is often fueled by fear and anxiety.
Okay.
And elected leaders will exploit these fears about things like immigration, crime, or economic decline to justify their power grabs. And they'll claim that they're the only ones who can protect the nation from these perceived threats.
Oh, so classic.
Yeah, it's a very classic tactic.
Create a sense of crisis and then present yourself as the solution.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've kind of talked about those broad trends.
Yeah.
But Walter also dives into some of the factors that make a society particularly susceptible to civil wars. She says is the rise of superfactions.
Yeah, superfactions.
Which sounds ominous.
It does sound ominous.
What is a superfaction?
So in a healthy democracy, you have different political parties, interest groups, they compete for power and influence, but they all kind of agree on the basic rules of the game and the legitimacy of the system. Superfactions are different. They go beyond typical political disagreements. They're deeply rooted in identity. Often ethnicity, religion, or ideology. And their members see the other side not just as opponents, but as existential threats.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's not just about winning an election. It's about
survival.
Your whole way of life.
Exactly. Yeah. The survival of their group is at stake.
Wow. And she uses Yugoslavia as an example.
Yes. Yugoslavia is a textbook example of how superfactions can tear a nation apart.
So how did that play out?
So Yugoslavia was this federation of republics that were held together by this complex system of ethnic and political alliances. And after the death of its longtime leader, Josip Broz Tito, in 1980, these simmering ethnic tensions started to boil over.
So Tito was kind of keeping a lid on things.
Exactly.
And then he dies, and then
everything starts to unravel. And that's where Slobodan Milosevic comes into the picture.
And he was the Serbian leader, right?
Yes, he was the Serbian leader.
Yeah.
And he exploited these tensions for his own political gain.
Classic.
Yeah, he was a master manipulator. He tapped into a sense of Serbian nationalism and grievance. He painted Serbs as victims of historical injustices. And he whipped up fear of other ethnic groups.
So he
used the media to spread his propaganda. And he consolidated his power within the Serbian government.
So he created a Serbian superfaction.
Exactly.
Within Yugoslavia.
That's right.
What about the other groups?
Well, of course, they pushed back. The Croatians, led by Franjo Tudjman, had also been nurturing their own sense of ethnic identity and political ambitions. And so as Milosevic consolidated Serbian power, Croatians grew fearful of being marginalized. And so both sides started to see each other as existential threats.
So they mirrored each other.
Exactly, yeah. And the situation spiraled into violence.
And that ultimately led to war.
Yes, the tipping point came when Croatia declared independence in 1991.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So that was...
The Serbs living in Croatia, fueled by Milosevic's rhetoric and fearing for their safety, rose up in rebellion.
Wow.
And the Yugoslav People's Army, which was largely dominated by Serbs, joined the fray. And the country descended into this brutal civil war.
Wow.
Yeah, it was marked by ethnic cleansing and just horrific atrocities.
It's crazy how these things can just unravel so quickly.
It is, yeah. It's terrifying how quickly a seemingly stable society can just fracture along ethnic lines.
And this reminds me of other examples like Rwanda.
Right.
Where you have these ethnic entrepreneurs that play a central role.
Exactly. And it highlights the critical role of responsible leadership and the need to address grievances before they fester into violence. And it also underscores the danger of these ethnic entrepreneurs, these individuals or groups who exploit these divisions for their own political gain.
So are they always political leaders, or can it be other people?
It can be anyone with influence.
Okay.
Yeah, think about business elites, religious leaders, or even media personalities, hungry for ratings. They all have something to gain from stoking division and fear.
And it seems like social media has made that even easier.
Well, absolutely.
For these voices to spread.
Social media has been a game changer. Walter argues that social media, with its algorithms designed to amplify engagement, has become a really powerful accelerant for factionalism.
How so?
Well, it's incredibly easy for extremists to spread disinformation, to stoke fear and outrage, and incite violence.
And it's designed to keep us hooked.
Exactly. These algorithms prioritize content that keeps us hooked.
Right.
So they often end up promoting the most outrageous and divisive material,
Right.
regardless of its accuracy or impact.
It's like our brains are just wired to be drawn to this stuff.
Yeah, it is. It's like we can't look away even when we know it's bad for us.
It's like a car crash, right?
Exactly.
You don't want to look.
Thank you.
We can't help it.
Yeah.
So you've got these super factions emerging,
Right.
fueled by identity politics, amplified by social media. But Walter also talks about this concept of the downgraded group.
Yeah, the downgraded group.
What is that and how is that relevant?
So a downgraded group refers to a group that once held a privileged position in society,
Okay.
but now they see their status slipping away.
Okay.
So they might be losing access to resources, political power,
Okay.
or even their cultural dominance.
So it's not just being marginalized. It's like you're on top.
Right. It's about the psychological impact of falling from grace.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and that can lead to resentment.
Absolutely. Yeah. This sense of decline can be a really potent driver of resentment and a breeding ground for violence.
Right.
When people feel like they've lost something.
Yeah.
Power, status, resources, they're more likely to lash out,
Right.
especially if they believe that the system is rigged against them.
Right.
And this makes them particularly susceptible to the appeals of ethnic entrepreneurs
Right.
who offer scapegoats and promises of restoring their lost glory.
Right. So she uses the Moro people in the Philippines
Exactly.
as an example of this.
So the Moro had long been the dominant group in the Mindanao region of the Philippines.
Okay.
But as the government encouraged Catholic migration to the area,
Yeah.
the Moro found themselves increasingly displaced.
Okay.
They were losing land jobs and political influence.
Okay.
And this sense of being downgraded
Yeah.
really fueled resentment and ultimately contributed to the outbreak of a long-running conflict.
So is this just ethnic groups or can it be any group?
It can be any group
Yeah.
that perceives a loss of status.
So like an economic group or?
It could be, economic, social, any group.
Wow.
Yeah. Walter provides another fascinating example from Northern Ireland. After the partition of Ireland in 1921,
Okay.
Irish Catholics found themselves a minority within this Protestant-dominated state.
Right.
And they faced systematic discrimination.
Right.
They had limited voting rights.
Right.
And they were largely shut out of political and economic power.
Right.
And so the sense of being downgraded, of having their rightful place in society kind of usurped, fueled decades of conflict and violence, known as the Troubles.
The Troubles.
Yeah.
So whether it's based on ethnicity or religion or even perceived social status, this feeling of being downgraded can create a very volatile situation.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
Right. And so then she talks about what are those sparks that set things off.
Well, protests, for example, can be a healthy expression of discontent within a democracy.
Right.
But in a factionalized democracy where tensions are already running high, a poorly handled protest can quickly escalate into violence.
Like in Syria.
Exactly. Syria is a perfect example of this.
Right.
The Arab Spring uprisings, which started with these peaceful protests demanding greater freedoms, quickly devolved into a brutal civil war.
So how did that happen?
Well, in 2011, these peaceful protests erupted in Syria, demanding reforms and an end to President Bashar al-Assad's authoritarian rule.
Right.
Assad, facing pressure from this majority Sunni population, responded with brutal force. He cracked down on protesters, imprisoned dissidents. And this heavy-handed response completely backfired.
Instead of calming things down, it just made things worse.
It just made things so much worse.
Right. So it's almost like people might have been okay with some reforms, but then when he cracked down, they're like, no.
That's it.
We're done.
Yeah, we're done talking. We're going to fight.
Right.
Yeah.
So it really highlights the importance of listening to those grievances.
Absolutely.
And respecting the right to peaceful assembly. And finding ways to address those concerns.
Yes, through dialogue and compromise.
Through dialogue and compromise.
Yeah.
Now, she also talks about how elections can be dangerous.
Yeah, elections, while they're a cornerstone of democracy, they can also be incredibly dangerous in these factionalized societies.
So how's that?
Well, imagine a scenario where a downgraded group pins all their hopes on an election, believing it's their chance to regain some of their lost power or influence.
It's their last hope for a peaceful solution.
Exactly. Now, if they lose that election, and especially if they perceive it as rigged or unfair, their faith in the system can just evaporate.
Wow.
And they might feel like they have no other options left.
Yeah.
But to resort to violence.
And that's happened.
It has, yeah. She cites the 1993 civil war in Burundi,
Okay.
which was triggered after the minority Tutsis,
Okay.
who had historically held power, lost the country's first multi-party elections.
Okay.
And they saw this defeat as an existential threat.
Wow.
And it led to a violent uprising that plunged the country into chaos.
Wow. And even in the U.S.,
Yeah.
the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860
Right.
was kind of a catalyst.
It was?
It was catalyst for the South's secession
Right.
and the outbreak of the Civil War.
Right.
Yeah. So it's a reminder that elections,
Wow.
while essential for democracy,
Yeah.
can also be incredibly dangerous.
In certain contexts.
Yes, in certain contexts.
So it's all about managing expectations and ensuring a sense of fairness and addressing those underlying grievances.
Exactly.
If a significant portion of the population feels like the system is rigged against them and their voices aren't being heard, that violence can become a very real possibility.
Absolutely.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From the dangers of anocracy and the rise of superfactions to the role of ethnic entrepreneurs.
And the volatility of downgraded groups. So Walter paints a pretty sobering picture.
She does.
Of the factors that can push a society towards civil war.
Yeah.
But she also offers some potential solutions.
She does.
For safeguarding our democracies
Yeah.
and preventing these conflicts from erupting.
Right.
So in the next part of our deep dive,
Yes.
we'll delve into those solutions.
I'll talk about what we can do.
Right, because she doesn't just leave us with a sense of impending doom.
No, she doesn't.
She offers concrete steps we can take, both individually and collectively,
Yes.
to strengthen our democracies and build a more peaceful and just world.
Exactly.
Let's take a break here and come back.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Librarian Oasis. Okay, so we've spent the first part of this deep dive really digging into the problem.
Yeah, sort of laying the groundwork.
Yeah, exactly. And it is a bit heavy.
A little bit, yeah.
But it's good to understand it.
It's important to understand it, yeah.
So, but Walter doesn't just leave us there, right?
No.
She actually offers some solutions.
Right. She wants to give us hope.
Yeah. She wants to give us hope.
Yeah.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what are those solutions?
Okay.
Where do we start?
Well, one of the most urgent recommendations she makes is tackling the spread of disinformation on social media.
Okay.
We talked about how these platforms can really act as accelerants,
Right.
amplifying outrage and pushing people toward extremes.
Right.
And she argues that we need to hold these tech giants accountable for the content that flourishes on their platforms.
You know, it's funny because when I think about it, it's like, why are these platforms treated so differently than traditional media?
Right.
You know, newspapers, TV, radio.
We have regulations.
They have regulations. They have journalistic ethics.
Right.
Legal consequences for
Correct.
spreading false information. Why is social media different?
Well, that's exactly her point.
Okay.
She argues that this lack of accountability has allowed disinformation to run rampant.
Right.
It's poisoning our political discourse and undermining trust in institutions.
It is.
Yeah.
So how do we rein that in?
Right.
Without stifling free speech?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a tricky balance.
Yeah. How do you find that balance?
Right.
You know.
Well, she suggests a multi-pronged approach.
Okay.
She says, first of all, greater transparency from these companies is crucial.
Okay.
We need to understand how their algorithms work, how they amplify certain voices and suppress others.
Right.
We also need to know who's funding these platforms and what their motivations are.
Are they truly neutral or?
Exactly, yeah. Are they truly neutral platforms for information sharing, or are they being used to manipulate public opinion?
Right.
So transparency is a good starting point.
Right. If you don't even know.
Right. If we don't even know how these platforms are shaping our information landscape.
Right.
How can we make informed decisions about what to believe?
Right.
But transparency alone isn't enough.
Right.
We need ways to identify and remove demonstrably false and harmful content.
Okay. But that's a really tricky area.
It is very tricky.
Who gets to decide?
Exactly. Yeah. Who gets to decide what's true and what's not?
Right.
But she argues that we can't just throw up our hands and say it's too difficult.
Okay.
We need to develop robust systems for identifying and addressing harmful content.
Okay, so what does that look like?
Well, it could involve a combination of human oversight,
Okay.
artificial intelligence,
Okay.
and independent fact-checking organizations.
Right.
And we need to hold individuals and organizations accountable
Right.
for knowingly spreading disinformation.
So it's about finding that balance
Right.
between free speech and...
Protecting society from harmful content.
Right.
Yeah.
But her recommendations go beyond just disinformation, right?
Yes, they do.
She talks about institutions.
Yes, she argues that bolstering trust in our elections is absolutely crucial.
Okay.
We've seen how contested elections,
Yeah.
particularly in societies that are already divided,
Right.
can be a major trigger for violence.
Right, like January 6th.
Exactly. January 6th was a perfect example of this.
Right.
It was fueled by these claims of election fraud,
Right.
which were amplified by social media
Right.
and certain political figures.
Right. It was a very scary moment.
It was a stark reminder
Yeah,
that even in a country like the United States, democracy is fragile.
it is.
Yeah, if enough people lose faith in the electoral process, it creates a breeding ground for extremism and violence.
So how do we restore faith in our elections?
Right.
How do we convince people that their vote matters?
Well, she suggests several reforms,
Okay.
including moving toward a more centralized and independent election management system.
Okay.
She points to Canada as an example, where elections are overseen by a nonpartisan body.
Okay, so not the parties themselves.
No.
Okay.
And this can help reduce the potential for partisan interference
Right.
and minimize opportunities for fraud.
So it's like a neutral party.
Yeah, a neutral third party.
Right. But what about those claims of voter fraud
Right.
that are always used?
Well, she believes that automatic voter registration could be a powerful tool
Okay.
by making registration the default
Right.
rather than an opt-in process.
Okay.
We can create a more inclusive and representative electorate.
Right.
And it also makes it harder to disenfranchise voters or manipulate the system.
Right, because everybody's automatically registered.
Right, everybody's in.
Right. So you can't purge voter rolls or anything.
Exactly.
But shouldn't we also make it easier to vote?
Yes, absolutely.
Like early voting mail-in ballots?
Yeah.
Maybe even make Election Day a national holiday.
All great ideas. The easier it is for people to vote,
Right.
the less likely they are to feel excluded or disenfranchised.
Yeah.
And that ties into another key aspect of her recommendations,
Okay.
which is promoting civic engagement and cross-cultural understanding.
So when you say civic engagement, what does that mean?
Well, it's about fostering a sense of shared purpose and responsibility. She argues that a healthy democracy requires active participation from its citizens.
Yep.
And this goes beyond just voting in elections. It's
Even.
about being informed about the issues,
Okay.
engaging in our communities, and being willing to engage in respectful dialogue with people who hold different views.
So it's about rebuilding that sense of community.
Exactly. Yeah. Rebuilding that sense of community, of belonging,
Right.
of working together to solve common problems.
Right. It does feel like we've lost some of that
We have.
in recent years.
Yeah.
And so she talks about creating more spaces
Yes.
for constructive dialogue.
Exactly. More spaces for constructive dialogue and conflict resolution.
Okay, so what does that look like?
Well, she highlights initiatives like living room conversations.
Okay, I've heard of that.
Yeah.
What's that?
It brings people together from across the political spectrum
Okay.
to engage in respectful conversations
Okay.
and build bridges of understanding.
So it's like, let's just sit down and talk.
Yeah, let's just talk. Let's listen to each other.
Yeah.
Let's try to understand where we're coming from.
That seems like a tall order these days.
It is a tall order.
Yeah.
But she argues that it's essential if we want to safeguard our democracies.
Okay.
She points out that polarization itself doesn't necessarily lead to civil war.
Okay.
What's dangerous is when polarization hardens into factionalism,
Right.
where groups see each other as existential threats
Right.
and lose faith in the possibility of compromise.
Right. It's not about erasing our differences.
Right. It's about managing those differences constructively.
Right.
Yeah,
And rebuilding a sense of shared purpose.
exactly.
So just how worried should we be?
Yeah.
Is the U.S. really on the brink of civil war?
That's a question I think a lot of people are asking themselves these days.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to think about it. given everything that's going on.
It is, yeah.
So what does she say?
Well, she addresses this question directly in the book.
Okay.
And while she doesn't offer any easy answers, she does lay out the warning signs that we need to be aware of.
Okay.
And the steps we can take to mitigate the risk.
Okay. I'm definitely eager to hear more about that.
Yeah.
Let's pick up this conversation in the next part of our deep dive. Let's take a break here and come back. Welcome back to Librarian Oasis. So we've spent the last couple parts of this deep dive kind of unpacking this book, How Civil Wars Start.
It's been a journey.
It has been a journey.
A little unsettling at times, but really important, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I think Walter does a really good job of
yeah,
laying it all out there.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, she doesn't sugarcoat it.
No, she doesn't.
Right.
But she also
offers hope, too.
She offers a path forward.
Right. And so that's what I want to kind of focus on in this last part is like,
yeah.
Okay, so we see the problem, but what do we do about it?
Right. What can we do?
How worried should we be? Is the U.S. really on the brink of civil war?
Right. I think that's the question on everyone's mind.
It is. It's hard not to think about it, you know?
Yeah, with everything that's going on. So
she says that the U.S. is displaying some worrying signs.
Like, what are those warning signs?
Well, we've already talked about factionalism and how people are starting to see the other side not just as opponents, but as enemies.
Right.
And she points to the growing divide between Democrats and Republicans.
Right. It's like you're either with us or against us.
Exactly.
There's no middle ground.
Yeah. It's not just about policy disagreements anymore.
Right.
It's about this fundamental clash of values and worldviews.
And it's like you can't even have a conversation.
Right. You can't even talk to
somebody
who disagrees with you.
Without it turning into a fight.
Right, exactly. And that's what she's saying is so dangerous.
Right.
Because when you get to that point,
yeah,
it erodes trust and makes compromise impossible.
Right.
Because each side sees the other as an existential threat.
And she also talks about the decline in trust in institutions.
Yes, that's another big one.
It's like people don't trust the government.
Yeah.
They don't trust the media.
Right? They don't even trust our electoral processes.
Yeah, it seems like everything is up for grabs.
Yeah, and that's incredibly dangerous.
Because then where do you even turn?
Right, if you don't trust the system.
If you don't trust anybody.
Then you're more likely to embrace extreme solutions.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It is, yeah. The more people lose faith in the system,
yeah,
the more likely they are to disengage or even turn against it.
Right.
And that just further erodes trust, making it even harder to address the underlying problems.
Right. And then, of course, you have social media. It just throws gasoline on the fire.
It does. It acts as an accelerant.
Right.
Spreading disinformation, creating echo chambers.
Right. Where you only see what you already agree with.
Exactly.
So you never get exposed to other viewpoints.
Right. And you just become more and more entrenched in your own beliefs.
And she uses January 6th as an example.
Yeah. January 6th was a chilling example.
Of how all of these things can come together.
And lead to violence.
So what do we do?
Well, that's the big question.
How do we stop this?
Right. How do we prevent this from happening again?
Right.
Because it would be easy to just dismiss January 6th.
Right. Like, oh, that was a one-off.
That'll never happen again.
It can't happen here.
But she says we can't afford to be complacent.
Right.
The warning signs are flashing.
Right.
And we need to take them seriously.
So what can we do?
Well, she offers a roadmap for solutions.
Okay.
And it starts with recognizing that we all have a role to play. In safeguarding our democracy.
So it's not just up to the politicians.
It's not just up to the politicians.
We all have to do our part.
We all have a responsibility to protect our democracy.
And so what does that look like?
Well, she stresses the importance of individual action.
Okay.
She encourages us to engage in constructive dialogue with people who hold different views.
Okay.
To challenge disinformation when we see it.
Right.
And to support organizations that are working to bridge divides and strengthen our democratic institutions.
It's about rebuilding trust.
Yes. Rebuilding trust in each other and in the systems that are supposed to represent us.
So it's a bottom-up approach.
It is, yeah. It starts with us.
But she also talks about systemic changes, right?
Like
reforming our electoral processes.
Yes.
Regulating social media to curb the spread of disinformation.
Right.
And promoting civic education.
Yes, teaching people how to think critically about the information they're consuming.
So it's a multi-pronged approach. Addressing both the symptoms and the underlying causes.
Exactly.
And it's going to take time.
It's a long-term project.
Right.
There's no quick fix.
But she's optimistic.
She believes that democracy is resilient, that we have the tools to address these challenges.
Okay.
And that even amidst these deep divisions, there are countless people working to build a more just and equitable society.
Yeah, I love that she ends on a hopeful note.
Me too.
Because it's easy to feel overwhelmed.
It is.
By all of this,
Yeah.
But she reminds us that even small acts of courage, compassion, and civic engagement can make a difference.
They can.
She uses a great analogy in the book.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about it.
She talks about how cancer starts with a single mutated cell.
Right.
Right. And if ignored, that cell can multiply and spread and eventually overwhelm the body.
Kill the body.
Right. But if caught early,
right,
it can often be treated successfully.
Right.
And so she's saying it's the same with factionalism and political violence.
Yeah, we need to be aware of the risks.
Right.
Identify those early warning signs.
Right.
And take steps to address them.
Before it's too late.
Before it metastasizes and threatens the very fabric of our society.
And it's not about eradicating all conflict or disagreement.
No.
Because that's impossible.
Can't do that.
You can't do that.
Right.
Especially in a diverse society.
Right.
It's about recognizing the difference between healthy debate and toxic factionalism that can tear us apart.
Exactly.
And so she ends the book with this really thought-provoking question.
Oh, yeah. What is it?
What will future generations say about how we handled this moment in history?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Will they see us as the generation that allowed democracy to crumble?
Right.
Or the generation that rose to the challenge?
Right.
And strengthened its foundations for generations to come?
That's a question we all need to be asking ourselves.
It is. So how civil wars start is a chilling wake-up call.
It is.
But it's also a call to action.
It is.
It's a reminder that the fate of our democracy is ultimately in our hands.
I agree with that.
So we encourage you to check out the book.
Yes.
For a deeper dive into this really crucial topic.
You might be surprised by what you learn.
Yeah. And the importance of civic engagement.
Yes.
In protecting democracy.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us for another deep dive here at Librarian Oasis.
We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive with us, and we look forward to exploring more fascinating topics with you in the future. Until then, happy reading and stay curious.